Hi everyone, Charles from The Food People here. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. It's my great pleasure to welcome Anthony Warner to In Conversation with today, a biochemistry trained chef who, after working in hotels and restaurants, turned to product innovation and development for some of the best known UK brands. In 2016, frustrated by pseudoscience and misinformation in the food industry, Anthony started a blog which led to his best-selling book, The Angry Chef, and to a further career in journalism. Anthony is our guest today to talk to us about his book, Ending Hunger, The Quest to Feed the World Without Destroying It. So welcome, Anthony, and thank you so much for joining me today as part of the Food People in Conversation with.
No, thank you. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me on.
No problem.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
At The Food People, we're very clear about what we do. We're champions of change driven every day by our intent to shift the future of food and drink by harnessing the power of trends. And in this In Conversation with series, it's all about talking to other people, businesses, brands, entrepreneurs, to find out more about why they do what they do, how in their way they're championing change and shifting the future of food and drink. So on that note, Anthony, great to be speaking to you today. And I really want to talk to you, obviously, about your new book. But before we do that, can you just explain how and why you transitioned from industry to writer? What led you to become the Angry Chef?
Yeah, I mean, it was... I think you said it was about 2016 I started the blog, and actually went back to I went to Food Matters Live, the big food innovation show, which I'm sure most people watching will be aware of. And I was sat in their sort of big talk theatre, listening to someone who was like a clean eating sort of blogger at the time when that clean eating trend was coming through. And I'd sort of picked it up vaguely because I work in food innovation and tried to follow trends. And I'd sort of heard that there was this sort of clean eating type bloggers who were talking about health and food, and I went to have a listen. And as I was listening, I thought, oh my God, I was just becoming really worried about some of the stuff that this individual was talking about, because it was, the kind of sort of pseudo-scientific nonsense that I'd heard sort of years before, and I thought we kind of got rid of and seen the back of. So like the alkaline diet and sort of meat and dairy drawing calcium from your bones by some sort of alkalizing in the body, which is pure sort of rank pseudoscience. And I started to become really concerned, and then I looked into it more and more, and I thought, God, this is really quite worrying. And I work in the food industry, so I'm interested in health claims and how they can be made, and I work for big brands, so I'm interested in or I'm worried when I think consumers are being misled, and as someone who's trained as a scientist, I also had a sort of passion for good quality scientific information. So it started to really worry me, and I thought, well, maybe I'll sort of start writing something about it, essentially as a blog to share with a few friends in the industry who are similarly concerned about these sort of things, sort of nutritionists working in the industry and other chefs. And that was literally what it was supposed to be, just to share with a few people. It kind of gained quite a lot of momentum quite quickly, because I think other people were getting quite frustrated about it. Yeah. A lot of food journalists and food writers sort of picked up on it fairly early on and started sharing it, and it became quite popular. And then then I started writing. I started writing for New Scientists picked it up, and then I started writing them for a bit, and the Sunday Times eventually I started writing a column for them, and the book deals happened in a very short period of time, and eventually ended up writing the book, The Angry Chef. So that's kind of where it came from. It came from a place of just being, this is a bit wrong, I'm a bit worried about something that's going on here. And I think there was this whole new media thing happening, with people reaching large audiences very quickly. And these weren't sort of little niche accounts. These were big accounts with millions of followers and selling lots and lots of books. I think there was a frustration building in the background, which I was quite sort of fortunate, I suppose, to tap into. And then it became quite popular. And then since then, I've just been interested in exposing that sort of misinformation in the world of food and exposing the big issues and problems within our food systems, and that's what sort of led me to writing now a trilogy of books.
What makes you angry and why? How would you reply to that?
I think I want to point out here as well, because people often get disappointed that I'm not quite angry enough in person. The Angry Chef was a character, you know, it was a blog that I wrote in character. It's a little cartoon chef and stuff, and he gets angry and rants and swears quite a lot. I mean, I am a chef. I do use that sort of language sometimes in my life, but I'm not an aggressive sort of person really. But it suited that sort of ranting style. What really makes me angry though, what makes the Angry Chef angry, or what makes me is misinformation in the world of food. It's when people are misled, when people are exploited, when people's fears are exploited, and when pseudoscience sort of sends us in the wrong direction, you know, which is, I mean, it's never more important than it has been in the last 12 months certainly, and will be for the next few months. You know, so that sort of thing really upsets me. And you know, I'm also, I am a chef, so you know, I'm interested in cooking, and food's my passion, and it has been for my entire career. So I felt, especially when there's trends like clean eating and a lot of the diet and health trends in food, it really is stripping the joy out of food. And although, you know, there is a need to have a sensible diet and have a, you know, varied and interesting diet, I think when you get to this sort of guilt and moralizing about food, that's really, really troubling for me. I think it just takes away what food should all be about, but it also can play on vulnerable people's minds, and does have this ability to feed into eating disorders. So you know, I'm someone who I thought it was kind of my role as someone who loves food to actually stand up for it and say, no, this sort of guilt and moralizing, we should get back to actually what food's all about, which is about pleasure, and it's about togetherness, and it's about bringing people together, and it's about moments of joy and all those sort of things. So it was really, you know, and I think that's what a lot of people picked up on very early on in my writing, was that even though I am sort of about exposing misinformation, what I'm actually about is getting food back to what it should be, which is joy, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, and that comes through very clearly in your latest book, which we'll talk about in a second, is that you're clearly someone who, whilst you've got industry experience and a scientific background, but you are a chef, and that comes through loud and clear, and the pleasure and the joy that comes from that you get from eating food, and a whole variety of food, which in the book you know, presents itself as a challenge and a quandary, which we'll go on to talk about. So your new book, Ending Hunger, can you just characterize for us, you know, what exactly is wrong with our food system, and how is it broken? You know, what are the main issues that should be concerning us?
Yeah, there are problems, and it's you know, I'm someone who the reason why this book's quite difficult for me to write, I suppose, was that I'm someone who has spent most of my writing career telling people, don't feel guilty about what you eat, don't let other people make you feel guilty about what you eat. You know, you should eat however you want to, that's your choice, and you know, and all these sort of values. But you know, then recognizing that there are problems with our food system and a need to change the way we eat is you know, a difficult ground for me to tread, and so I needed to sort of think long and hard about it. I learned a huge amount during the process. What's wrong with our food system is, you know, the way the pattern of eating we currently have, the way we eat now, and the way that is going globally especially is not sustainable. You know, it's having an enormous impact upon our environment, not just you know, the greenhouse emissions linked to agriculture, which are significant, but also, you know, the effect on natural habitats, obviously the way, you know, the way we use land, and you know, the way it's sort of taking up so much of our natural habitats are being destroyed, and the use of water and all these things. We're on a path which is not sustainable, and at some point is going to break down. And it's going to break down in a number of ways. We'll run out of fresh water in a number of parts of the world. We will completely have destroyed, you know, forest land in a certain amount of time. All around the world, all tropical forests would have been cut down, and all these things. And that's the path we're heading to. And also, actually, eventually, by about 2050, will have caused 2 degrees of global warming all on its own. That's just agriculture. So even if we stop all other greenhouse emissions, we'll still cause 2 degrees of global warming just by the way we're producing food. And so that dramatically needs to change. And that means it needs to change in the way we produce food, but also in the way we consume food and our eating behaviours. So that's a massive issue. And we are heading towards this point. There's pretty wide scientific consensus that that's the point we're heading towards. And so we need to do something about it. And we're just not having that conversation generally. Maybe we have other things to worry about right now in the world, bigger immediate problems, but the problems are happening are huge, and we must play that out as well with this expanding population and the fact that we need to keep people fed. We can't allow hunger. There's enough hunger in the world as there is right now. There are 800 million people in the world who genuinely don't have enough food to eat, or who are have insufficient calories in their diet, and a further 2 billion probably who have insufficient diets, who have malnutrition of some sort, and that's a massive problem, and that's been going down for years and years and years. But the last couple of years, it's been sort of going up, those figures. So that's a real worry, and we really need to remember that when we're talking about reducing the environmental impact of food. It shouldn't mean making, we shouldn't ever let that push more people into hunger, because that's just not. That's kind of the area the book looks at, the interplay between those two things, reducing the impact of our diets, but also making sure we continue to reduce hunger around the world, because it's the biggest barrier to progress that there is.
I thought that was the really interesting angle of the book, is that it looks at it through those two positions of hunger and sustainable food systems into the future, rather than just looking at one or the other. Is there?
Yeah, it's very just. Sorry to interrupt.
No, carry on.
It's very easy to say, we should make less of X and we should make less of Y. We should grow less soy. We should grow less palm. We should grow less wheat. It's very easy to say that, but you need to feed people. You can't let reducing the environment impact be at the expense of people having enough food to eat. And if you do, it's just not a solution. There are solutions there. They're not this sort of stop growing this plant or whatever. Yeah.
And if there are, and you touched on some of the issues there, can you just explore some of the ones that are having the greatest impact, just in a little more detail for us, just to bring those to life for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one, unfortunately, is animal product consumption. That's the thing that has the biggest impact on our environment, and there's the biggest capacity for change within that. So people will know these figures, but animal agriculture, 14.5% of greenhouse emissions. Obviously, there's reasons to argue about that figure, but that's a pretty well accepted figure by a lot of global bodies, which is not it's not like all of greenhouse emissions, but it's a significant chunk, and it's increasing every year. 3-4% increase in global meat consumption every year. And we may look at the UK or Europe and say, we're reducing our meat consumption, we're doing really well, but globally it is growing 3-4% a year, as people want to have diets a bit more like our diet and a bit more like the American diet around the world. We're growing huge quantities, especially of pork and chicken, and that has an enormous impact on not only on climate change emissions, but also on land use, because you have to feed those animals something. Animals are generally not as efficient as just eating the protein, feeding that directly to people. So you end up using more land if you're growing and producing animals, even if you're producing them in sort of factory type situations. And that's the biggest change that we can make. The thing that's having the most impact is the animal product consumption, and we need to reduce that. And there's sort of no way around that. People say, but we just need to eat better meat or whatever. But if there are limits on how much you can produce, there are limits on how many animals that we can produce sort of globally, and we need to live within those limits. And we're not living within those limits now, and we're actually getting further away from living in those limits, because it's meat production will probably have doubled by sort of 2040.
And right now, I mean, we're obviously seeing we're in January. We're in the veganuary season, but we're also seeing this counter argument to veganuary, reganuary, promoting regenerative agriculture. Do you think this can play a part in a sustainable food future?
Not only can it play a part, it's an absolutely vital part. I'm not someone who's ever going to promote global veganism, because I just don't believe it's achievable, but I also don't believe it's sensible. There is certainly a role within any agricultural system for a certain amount of animal agriculture, and regenerative farming. Obviously, I talked about pork and chicken earlier. Ruminant animals, cows and goats and sheep, on certain land are the best use of that land. Plenty of land, especially in this country, is unsuitable for growing crops. Most of this country is unsuitable for growing crops. Having some animals on the land is a better thing to do with certain areas, and also does create a better, more circular food system, because animals will produce lots of manure to fertilize land, and they will eat crop residue, and they will use up waste, and as I said, they'll use land which can't be used for much else. There's a real role for that. That's incredibly important. But it's limited in scale, unfortunately, and that's what I think people don't quite understand, or not don't understand, but perhaps sort of fail to accept, is that there's a limit to how much, a very, very easily defined limit. There's plenty of papers on how much meat you can produce in that way, using up sort of stuff that we wouldn't otherwise use, and it's not very much. And so, in order to have a better food system, we need to reduce the amount of meat we eat, and that's an unfortunate truth. But that sort of meat production, I think, is incredibly valuable and incredibly important to promote. But we have to be realistic about how much can be produced in that way, and how much that means for how much we eat. Because if sort of we're eating a huge amount every week and saying, but it's but it's sort of nicely produced, and it's produced in a regenerative way, that's kind of meaning, well, what's everyone else in a week? You're just saying that only you and a few rich people essentially can eat meat. Everyone else has to make do, or is everyone else going to eat cheaper meat, which is badly produced, in which case the environmental problems still remain. So we have to really address that, and that's incredibly important. We're way beyond, in terms of the consumption levels globally and locally, we're way beyond what we can produce in a regenerative way. But that's why we have so much industrial farming. That's why we're growing so much soya in order to feed to animals, and so much palm in order to feed to animals, and so much wheat to feed to animals. Because we're beyond those levels of consumption now. I can't remember how much it is globally. I think it's about 100 grams person per day globally. I think I'm trying to remember the figures. And we, in the UK, we eat more than that. In the US and Brazil and a few other countries, they eat a lot more than that, 300 to 350 grams per person per day. And so we're already in much of the world, and in our part of the world, we're already way beyond those limits, and probably beyond those limits globally. So we need to somehow shift that down. We need to eat less. And actually, in many parts of the world, some of the poorer parts of the world, from a nutritional point of view, they could probably do with eating some more animal products. It'd probably be good, because some animal products are quite important in terms of nutrition. They're not essential. If you're a vegan in an affluent country and you have access to good variety of food, and you have potential to take supplements or fortified foods, it's absolutely fine. Veganism is not really a problem with it from a health perspective. But if you're in a poor part of the world, then some animal products within your diet can be incredibly important for nutritional status, for various sort of problems of deficiency disease. And so what we need to do is, the poorest people in the world probably need to eat a few more animal products. The richest people in the world need to eat a lot less animal products, and somewhere we need to meet a nice sort of global point in the middle where we're eating a sustainable amount of animal produce, but that's an incredibly difficult thing to change. I don't know how, honestly, it's very difficult to change behavior in that way. It requires a massive sort of cultural shift.
You mentioned a few moments ago, if we continue on this track where you see us being in 2050 and 2 degrees global temperature rise, what does that actually mean in practice to people who are watching this session today? What would that actually look like?
Well, what does a 2 degree global temperature rise look like? I mean, it's pretty bad. I mean, 2 degrees is probably going to happen, and it's pretty bad. It's a huge difference to the oceans, and it's destruction of most coral, and it's changing in the seasons, and a massive rise in extreme weather events. The more energy you put into a system, the more energy it has, and the more likelihood you have of getting these sort of severe weather events, hurricanes, storms, flooding, and that sort of thing, and wildfires in some parts of the world as well. So you will see a massive increase in those things. I mean, it's very difficult to actually predict what that's going to look like, but it's not going to look pretty. It's not going to be good. 2 degrees is probably a minimum of what's actually going to happen. When you start getting to 3 or 4 degrees, it starts getting pretty apocalyptic, really. And that 2 degree change is definitely one of the potential impacts of agriculture. But like I said, water shortages are happening now, and they're going to happen more and more in many parts of the world. We're way off the actual limit of how much water we can how much fresh water. But what we're doing is we're pumping a lot of fresh water out of aquifers. To irrigate in certain parts of the world, and that's being replaced by seawater. So that's fossil water. It's not going to be replaced. When we get to the end of that, we're going to have severe problems. There's not the irrigation infrastructure in many parts of the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's going to cause food shortages and enormous hardship in those parts of the world. And 2050 as well, all tropical forests will have been destroyed, and that's so we're worrying about sort of palm forest plantations and the effect they're having in Borneo. Well, by 2050 we'll have got rid of all the tropical forests, not just them. We'll have got rid of the Amazon, we'll have got rid of Central African forests, and all that flora and fauna in there, and all that wildlife destruction, but also the impact that will have on local environments, on local weather systems. The natural capital that you're destroying by doing that. The number of pharmaceutical interventions that come from plant diversity, it's most of them, and you're destroying most of that plant diversity and most of that animal diversity, and and this is within a lifetime. This is within our lifetime. This is 2050. It's not that far away, and the thought that's going to happen within our lifetime, I think, should wake people up and we should say, hang on a minute, we can't go there. We can't. Surely can't destroy all tropical forests, because what we're doing most of it for is to grow animal feed. We're growing food to feed to livestock animals, and we're actually going to be doing that at a point where hundreds of millions, billions of people are going to be going without food. So we'll be growing food, destroying all the forests in the world to grow food to feed to animals while people starve. And I just you start to think that that's not a system that we can continue with.
That's a pretty bleak picture. One question that I've got is, have we made any progress at all in recent years?
Well, look, yes, we have made extraordinary. I mean, generally speaking, we're on a path of progress. Humans tend to be. We made enormous progress with hunger in the past. Past 100 years, but also in the past 20 years, eliminating or reducing hunger in the poorest part of the world has been one of the most astonishing achievements of humanity, which we just don't talk about. And that's not been because of the industrial agriculture that I'm talking about. That's been almost in spite of it, really. It's just been through various sort of initiatives and various sort of very clever people working in the poorest parts of the world. Being huge progress in that regard. In terms of the environmental impact of food, there are a lot of better practices. There's a lot of stuff going on around the world that's good. There's a lot of small initiatives which are happening, and not just within in the poorest countries in the world. In the UK, there's lots of really fantastic farming initiatives, and hopefully we'll get a new sort of changes to our agricultural subsidy system, which will start to look at subsidising people for doing public good and for doing environmental protection measures rather than producing huge amounts of livestock or crops, and that will make a huge difference. So there's lots of good stuff going on around the world, but it's not joined up, and we're still heading on this path because of this perhaps unstoppable combination of population growth and also affluence.
Yeah.
So I think population probably grows about 1% a year. I can't remember the exact figure, but the economy probably grows. Global economy probably grows. It's had a bit of a blip this last 10 months, but it grows about 3 or 4% every year. And 3%, that's a growth in consumption, and that's an incredibly difficult thing to address without impacting on the world in some way.
Okay. We talked a few moments ago about if we accept the fact that we need to eat less meat, what are the alternatives that are out there? And we touched on one a few moments ago, which we're acknowledging that we can't produce enough scale when it comes to regenerative agriculture. There's also cellular agriculture. What are your thoughts on that, and also some of the other alternatives as well?
Yeah, cellular agriculture, I think it's an interesting technology. It's a fascinating technology, and it seems to be making some progress. I think just started selling it in a restaurant in I can't remember what country of the world. Yeah, and perhaps that will lead the way to it being moving more into industrial production. But it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's human cells, animal cells don't. No, I said human cells there. That's slightly disturbing. But obviously, a lot of the culture is based on culturing human cells. But animal cells don't. Mammalian cells don't really want to do that. They don't really want to grow in that way. So you have to alter them so that they are sort of that they are immortal cell lines, and you have to grow them under certain conditions, and they're very difficult conditions. You have to use a serum, which is very expensive and difficult to make, and usually that's used like a fetal bovine fetal serum or an equine fetal serum, which is not exactly sustainable, obviously, or vegan. There's probably a debate about whether any of those products are actually vegan. I don't think they are, really, are they? But you know what I mean. So it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, and you can maybe sort of grow the cells, but that's really difficult to do. I know people who've done it, not for these companies, but for in research, and they say it's a really hard thing to do, to grow those sort of cell lines. It's a real challenge. Especially, and the idea of doing it at scale is incredibly difficult. But people are working on it, and the serums to grow the cells have been, I think, are now free from animal products, but they're quite expensive still. My big worry about it is that it's difficult, and doing it on a sort of scale that's going to have any impact on global meat production, because global meat production is 300, probably more, 350 maybe, billion kilograms of meat every year. And at the moment we can grow like a burger and it costs like a few £100. And so if you're going to step up to making 10% of that, like 30 billion kilograms of cellular meat a year, the infrastructure investment in doing that is probably trillions of pounds, and I don't think that's really worth it. I think it'll be an interesting little thing for a few rich people to eat, and it maybe get to a point where it's perhaps produced on a small scale and in an equivalent sort of price to meat. At the moment, it's going to be very expensive. It's going to be like 50 quid for a chicken nugget, but and not particularly good one, if I'm honest, because they're just cells without sort of muscle structures and fibers and sinews, and building a steak with all those structures onto a scaffold is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Making tons of it, God, it sounds like a horrible engineering project. You know, I worked a bit on mycoprotein, and that's a difficult thing to produce, and that's kind of pretty suited to these sort of fermentation growth things. So I think it's an interesting idea. I don't think my view is I don't think it'll ever happen at scale enough to make an impact. Other options, I mean, there are plenty. You know, the insects. People talk about insects a lot. I think there's some interest there. I think, like most people, I probably think it's probably more useful for animal feed than anything else. They can, you know, you get certain things that can use up a lot of food waste, so that's probably a good thing. You can produce stuff anywhere, which is probably a good thing. But you know, there's that sort of slight yuck factor. You might have a certain amount of insects produced from waste, which is probably quite a good thing. But I don't think, again, I struggle to see where the scale of protein production, useful protein production, is going to come from. And the alternatives are, you have things that I actually work on a fair bit in my consultancy life is sort of plant-based burgers and sausages and things like that, which are interesting and are nice, and they're getting better, and they're mostly using extruded soy protein and extruded pea protein. A couple of others sort of coming along, sort of you know, hemp protein and lupins might be quite interesting. There's lots of reasons to be excited about them. You know, soy has this bad reputation, but actually as a crop grown to feed humans, it's pretty efficient, and it's pretty good at nitrogen fixing. I'm actually working a lot at the moment on a project to bring UK grown soy into market. And to use it in plant-based products. So you know, that's
as opposed to feeding it to animals.
Yeah. And actually, UK grown soy, it's not a massive crop, but it's getting bigger and bigger every year. It's getting the new varieties which you can grow over here, which are pretty good. I think I'm in Lincolnshire now, and everywhere pretty much south of here, you can kind of grow soy now, and it's a good crop to grow in rotation with wheat because it's a nitrogen fixer. So you look at, you know, people probably maybe even notice the rapeseed is declining quite rapidly because there's various problems with it, from insects and just a drop in the value of the market. But soy is doing pretty well, and if you can grow soy here and you can fix nitrogen into the soil, you add to the yield of the wheat next year. It's a great rotation crop. So that's sort of the interesting, sort of exciting things that I like to get involved with, because you're adding a bit more diversity into UK crops. And actually, I think all the soy grown in the UK goes into human food at the moment. Doesn't get turned into animal feed. The animal feed stuff that does get fed is generally grown in South America or North America. And you know, there's quite a lot of soy used as a flour in bread, but we're looking at taking that into plant-based ingredients, so we can have a locally grown plant protein. And I think that's an interesting little project, because it means that we're getting more diversity, but we're also looking at different ways of producing protein to feed to people within UK agriculture, and that's a sort of, there's sort of small things which might add up, because, you know, I mean, burgers and plant-based sausages, I think they're interesting, they're nice, and I work on them, and they're having an impact, and they're getting people talking. Greg's sausage roll got more people talking about veganism than any campaign by the Vegan Society in years. Now that's what all people want to talk about, was Greg's sausage rolls on the front page of every newspaper. And I think that was a really interesting step. But in truth, I think the real alternatives to in terms of protein, the real alternatives to meat are things that we already have. They're chickpeas and their lentils and their soybeans and their, you know, beans and pulses and legumes. They're plant-based protein, and they're the things we should be eating more of. And we have to start eating more of. And they already exist. And personally, I think, you know, I can't think of something. If I'm thinking of something like, even if I'm thinking of cell-grown meat, or I'm thinking of insects or something, well, is that better than lentils and chickpeas and dals and all those delicious things you can make of them? Well, I don't think it is, to be honest. I think we'd probably be better, rather than spending £1 trillion on infrastructure for cellular agriculture. I think we'd be better spending a few £1 million on campaigns to get people to eat more pulses and beans.
And that's really interesting, because that brings me on to the next question. Really, is what kind of behavior shift would you like to see be embraced? And there's two parts to this. One is by consumers. What if we're all consumers? What can we practically do to help shift the future of sustainable food and drink? What can we actually do? And then the second part is, what can we do as industry? But let's start with consumers. What can we practically
do? I mean, like I said, I don't like to sort of focus too much on individuals and say you should be doing this to change your diet and it's your responsibility, because that's kind of been the problem with all environmental activism over the years. It's been ended up pushing it back to the individual and saying, it's your fault. For your, it's not a systemic problem. So I do try and be careful. There are things we should do, but I do think we need to be a little bit careful about telling people off for eating wrong, because that's been.
Well, let's talk in a moment about kind of policy and so on. And it'd be good to. I'd love to. I'm sure. I mean, I'm listening. I'm thinking as an industry, as a representative and a voice within industry, but I'm also thinking, I'm going to cook dinner tonight. What are some of the things that perhaps at a consumer level, and then let's ladder up.
No, absolutely. I mean, it does start. Even though I like to start away from it, it does start with the consumer. There's no doubt that consumer choices are important. I had to. The actual conclusions at the end of my book had to be rewritten more than any other part of it, because I tend to shy away from telling people how they should eat, but sometimes you do have to tread that ground. Look, we should, and it is important, because we look at the world. What we do might feel trivial, but we look at the world, and what does the world now do? Well, it probably aspires to like the US style diet or the European affluent style diet. So it perhaps aspires to a type of eating that we do. So if we change our style of eating, hopefully we can inspire more, that sort of create a new way of eating, which is what people aspire to throughout the world. Maybe not, but that's kind of the hope. It's eating more plant protein, but it's also not doing that in a worthy fashion. I don't think. I think if we're saying you must eat more plant protein because that makes you a good citizen, well, that's no way to create behavior change. I think we know that's not a way to create behavior change. What we need to do is get beyond that and say these things are delicious and amazing, and they're things you should enjoy eating and things you will enjoy eating, and they should be your choices. Get away from this sort of a societal idea that every meal has to have meat at the center of it, which we kind of do now. Most of us. We don't always have meat for breakfast. Sometimes we do, but lunchtime and at dinner, a lot of people have to eat meat every single time, or have to eat an animal product every single time. And we need to be shifting away from that and replacing that with plant proteins and making them delicious and making them what people actually want to eat. And so those are the sort of changes we need to make. We need to be eating meat, and when we do, we need to be sort of valuing it far more and enjoying it far more, and having it as something that's special and revering it really far more than we do, rather than just it's a bit of dead animal in a sandwich every lunchtime. I mean, I hope that's something that we can kind of do, but I think we need to be very careful at pushing at people and saying you're doing that wrong. That's the wrong way to eat. There's not a wrong way to eat, but we should be just trying to enjoy the things that are better environmental choices and making them what people want to eat.
And let's then ladder up to a policy level on the governmental. On a kind of global level, what's the message at that level? What do we need to do to affect the biggest change? I
mean, agricultural subsidy systems globally, particularly in Europe, a lot in America as well. They need to change. They need to change dramatically. I think the EU spends something like 28 billion euros on subsidising animal agriculture. There are reasons why it does that, but but I think we need to change the way we think about agricultural subsidy systems and have them essentially, hopefully, the ELMs in the UK will actually work some way towards this and start looking at subsidizing public good and looking at land and how it's managed, and perhaps paying some people just to manage land. It doesn't honestly make sense to, if you have a bit of land where it is not economic, is to produce animals on it, and the only way of making it economic is to get subsidies from the government. Perhaps we shouldn't be producing animals on that land. Perhaps we should be using that land and paying those people to manage that land and to return it to its natural environment. Because people I think sometimes people think turning land back to natural environment involves just going and leaving it and going, I'll be fine. But it's not. It needs managing. It's not a trivial thing to do, and you need to pay people to do it. And if we're paying people who were farming the land to perhaps reduce their farming activity, because then I think that's a better thing to be doing, rather than just paying them to produce animals on land where it's not economic to produce it. And there's kind of we have a romantic attachment to the way the British countryside looks at the moment, and think of that as being natural, but a lot of it isn't. A lot of it's not a natural landscape, and returning more and more to natural landscape is an incredible thing to do for biodiversity, but it captures carbon. Whatever you say about people, whatever people say about regenerative agriculture, they compare it. They're saying if we produce animals on this, we will lock carbon in this land, and that's a great thing to do. Yes, that's a great thing to do. But they're often comparing it against producing a reasonably destructive crop on that land. When you compare it to actually having wild space in that land, going forested area in that land, then that's the better way. If you want to trap carbon, then that's the better thing to be doing. Look at policies which are all about keeping more carbon into the land and regenerating wild spaces, and spend all that money we spent subsidizing agriculture on those things. I think that would be some of the best work we can do.
And what about industry as well? I mean, many of the people watching this today will be working in innovation roles, in processing roles, marketing roles. There may be senior people watching as well. I feel as industry, we have a level of responsibility here. Is there a message to those individuals, questions they can ask, challenges that they can drive?
Yeah, no, huge. I mean, more, if you're working in the food industry as we do, there's perhaps more scope to actually make an impact than the majority of people pushing it down to consumer choice. If you're working within the industry, you should be looking at what you can do to encourage people to eat more plant-based foods, and the right sort of plant-based foods, because you can have plant-based, but it might not always be sort of ideal choices just because they're plant-based. How can people can eat more plant protein? How can we make those significant changes to change the way people feel about eating meat? How can we push against that, and not just create a small initiative with the wrong company, but change the ethos of the company to be pushing everything towards it? Because that you have one sort of brand that does a thing, whereas 5 other brands. That's what the fossil fuel industry has been doing for years. It is having an initiative to create regenerative energy as a small, tiny fraction of its business, and publicising that. I really want to see people pushing against that and saying the ethos of this company is about sort of positive environmental changes. I worry that we'll start sort of bringing in metrics to say more sustainable, front of pack sort of signifiers to say this is more sustainable. I think that's maybe useful. I'm not sure, because I know that people will always game the system. As they do with front of pack traffic light labelling. You'll game it so you have a low. You'll game the serving size so you have. I think everyone does it. I think even if they don't admit to it. So I worry about that. But what we really need is at the heart of the companies that needs to be this ethos of lessening its environmental impact of the food they eat, and moving consumers towards environmentally better choices. If we look at companies that do that, they tend to be better performing financially at the moment. Look at companies that were making better environmental choices and had sustainability at the heart of their agendas 25 years ago. they're doing better now than the companies that weren't, and that will only increase. I think it needs to be baked in to everything companies are doing now, especially working in food, which has such a significant environmental impact. You need to be. It's going to be difficult to define it in single metrics, and that's all. I talk about that quite a lot in the book. It's a big problem.
That's one of the things I was just going to ask you actually. Is how do we know that we're succeeding? What are the things we should measure?
It's very difficult to measure because these are systemic changes, and it's one of the big problems with this sort of behavior change, because you can start measuring one metric and it'll mess up the other one because you're so focused on that. That's a real problem.
Feels critically important within what your what land is used for what and where, and obviously I don't have the answer, but that feels critically important to this whole issue.
Land use is hugely important, as is carbon in the soil. Keeping more carbon in the soil, putting carbon back into the soil in some way, because so much of our agricultural production just draws carbon out of the soil. Especially in this country, part of the world where I live, in the east of England, we've got very little carbon in the soil because it's just crops are grown and it's difficult to get that carbon back. Land use is absolutely crucial, and we need to have a global perspective on that as well as a local perspective, because you can say we're not using much land for these intensively raised cattle. Well, we're using a hell of a lot of land in Brazil to grow soya, and they're cutting down the Amazon to make more room to grow more soya. So when you focus on land, that's probably on its own. So it's very difficult, very concrete, but we need to have a global perspective and a local perspective. We need to think about land use, we need to think about carbon in the soil, we need to think in certain parts of the world, we need to think about water very, very seriously over the next few years. That's why it's very difficult to bring it down to a single metric. I haven't got onto GMO because I know some people might get upset about that, but there is also a scope for some sort of genetically modified crops as well.
Under what sort of conditions? Because I think it's a really interesting topic, one that's been perhaps demonized in the past. So I'd be interested on your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think the demonization. It didn't. The way it was done didn't have merit. There were problems with the way the early GMOs were introduced. The Roundup Ready soy and cotton and whatever generally tended to, obviously, it was focused on using using Roundup and using glyphosate in quite large quantities. And glyphosate is a very good weaker. Agriculture would struggle without it, but it's I can understand how uncomfortable people were. Some of the BT crops, which have an insecticide within it, they're extremely useful. They really are, and can transform sort of agriculture in many parts of the world by reducing insecticide application. Look at there's BT aubergine now in Bangladesh, which has been fantastic for farmers there, because they have to, they get a crop which is insect resistant, and also, not so much of a problem here where it's very highly regulated, but if you're using a lot of pesticides, then that can be extremely dangerous and hazardous to the health of farmers. And there are a number of crops coming through. Drought-resistant crops are going to become more and more important, and we can't necessarily breed them fast enough in order to make significant change. So drought-resistant maize, disease-resistant plants like bananas, we potentially could lose the Cavendish banana in a reasonably in large parts of the world. There are genetically modified, unlicensed, currently genetically modified versions which would be resistant to the fungal disease attacking them. And then I talk in the book a bit about nitrogen fixing crops. Nitrogen fixing wheat, which it might not sound incredibly exciting, but would be revolutionary. Would essentially mean you wouldn't have to, the wheat would fix nitrogen from the air in the same way that legumes like peas and soy do, and would enable you to grow wheat essentially without using nitrogen fertilizer. Which is incredibly useful, but has a detrimental impact on the soil and is, I think, is responsible for like about 0.5% of all energy consumption in the world, production of nitrogen fertilizer. So it would also help help with that. You know, and if you could do that, that would be an astonishing achievement. But you know, I think we have to get over the fact that that you know, well, we have this certain squeamishness about genetically modified food for some reason. I mean, perhaps quite a lot to do with European policy on soy back in the 90s. You know, you'll remember as well. We used to have genetically modified crops in UK supermarkets. You know, we had tomatoes, flavour saver tomatoes back in the 90s, and they sold really well. And no one seemed to worry. And then suddenly it all seemed to go weird with that. But you know, there's potentially big environmental benefits of GM crops in used in a limited and sensible way. I worry that the power gets too much put back into the hands of large seed producers. I'd much rather, and a lot of the new crops are, you know, this is a fairly democratized technology now, and a lot of the new crops are produced by universities or institutions and could be offered free to people. You know, golden rice being a good example of that. So yeah, I mean, there's a place for GM. You know, I think in combination with I mean, actually, some of the most interesting work at the moment on the future of agriculture, it involves looking back to the past, somewhere, because we're losing, certainly in terms of insecticides and herbicides, we're losing a lot of those chemicals. So it's partly because they're you know, safety concerns, you know, like neonicotinoids, but also partly because of resistance building up to them. And so what people are doing now is looking back to the past and seeing how those things were managed in the past, and looking at different crop rotations and, you know, ways of
planting and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, actually, soy plays quite a good part in that in rotation with wheat. It's quite good for blackgrass because it breaks up the seasonal cycle of blackgrass, which you get if you do a rotation of wheat and rapeseed. Some of the most interesting work being done now is taking those old sort of ideas of crop rotations to manage weed and pest controls and different ways of planting, and getting an evidence base for them, actually doing proper science on those, because they kind of exist as ideas, but no one's really studied them. People are really starting to study them now because we're running out of chemicals and chemistry to put on the field, and also because people don't want to necessarily be putting chemistry on the field.
And this is a slightly loaded question, so my apologies, I wasn't on the list. Many of those listening will work within or be involved in the supply chain of the meat industry. What's your kind of advice, I suppose, to those businesses that are going, you know, there's a sea change here, there's a shift. What should we do? Yeah,
I mean, I suppose there might be some people that are sort of you know, shouting at me and saying, what do you mean we should be eating less meat? But I don't think there would actually be that many within the food industry. I think most of the companies that you're talking about, and the people that you're talking about, will have strategies. And you know, because I work with some of them, and they will have strategies based on, you know, what sort of proteins people are going to be consuming in 10 years' time, because everybody knows, certainly in the UK, you know, where veganism and vegetarianism, our market is more advanced than anywhere in the world, and I think that's a fair thing to say now. It's sort of having looked at various sort of different offerings around the world, we are further ahead in terms of our offering and with sort of how far veganism advanced. I'm not sure about numbers, obviously. You know, if you're talking about vegetarian and veganism, India is bigger than anywhere in the world. But in terms of Europe and the US, I think we're a little bit ahead. I think our market is more advanced, and you know, a lot of that comes from companies which do sell meat. You know, the Richmond sausage launch last year was a fantastic bit of innovation, and is the one that everyone's talking about. You know, the Greg's sausage roll, you know, is again a fantastic innovation that everyone was talking about. The smaller, more niche vegan brands don't have that sort of impact and that sort of cut through, and meat companies know that. And you know, you look at like Tyson in the US, they're investing in Beyond Meat, and they're investing in the Cellular Agriculture company. You know, Unilever investing in vegetarian butcher, isn't it? You know, most. In fact, I'd be surprised to say all significant meat companies are investing in the technology, and they're investing in change. And so, you know, the answer would be embrace that change. And if you can get to a point where you're producing products of which are equivalent using plant protein,
Yeah.
I can't see many people really sort of battling against that. I can see livestock farmers not wanting to do that, but perhaps there are areas as well where we should be looking for where change is, you know. And meat won't go away, but you know, we should be valuing it more, and we should be you know, selling it less as just a commodity that has to be eaten every day. And we, you know, these big companies should be diversifying, because you know, you can shout all we want, but this is coming. You know, this has to change, and you know, you need to be the companies that embrace that change. This change is coming, and you can't avoid it. So you have to not be left behind by the change, and you have to embrace it and start looking at these. And I honestly, every company I've spoken to, and I speak to a lot of them, is embracing that change. In a lot of them in a very serious way, and making very serious investments, and understand that this is where things are going. So what, something like, you'll probably know better than me, it's something like 25% of product launches last year were vegan.
If not more,
not more. Yeah, and you know, I mean, and even though veganism is sort of 1-2% of the population, obviously this rise of the flexitarian diet in this country is probably, you know, 50-60% of people following that, and that's going to drive this, and it's only going to get bigger and more normal as well. It's not going to be some weird niche thing. I mean, I think we, you know, the change in a short time has been astounding in this country, really. You know, from veganism going from being a really quite obscure little pursuit by a few people to being reasonably mainstream, and something that's on the edge of everyone's consciousness, and people are thinking about, you know, and thinking about making that change, at least in part. I don't want lots of people to go vegan. I want lots of people to make. I don't want a few people to go vegan. I want everyone to make changes. To the way they eat. I think that's far more significant. And for people in the meat industry, I would say, need to think about that change and embrace that change.
Brilliant. And as my last question to you would be, what is it that you would like to be famous, perhaps the wrong word, but certainly remembered for in what you're doing, particularly when it comes to journalism and your most recent book?
I think I know it doesn't particularly play entirely into what the content of my most recent book, but you know, I want to be remembered for the person who just tried to take some of that sort of guilt and worry out of people's eating choices, and get them back to pleasure, because that's always at the heart of what I do is cooking and food and love of food, and just try and get people back towards enjoyment as being the main thing, and actually, you know, togetherness as well, and bringing us together, because that's the most important aspect of food, and you know, people then sort of go, oh, well, that's all about home cooked meals round the table, but it's not. You know, food's a very diverse thing. People out there listening to this, working for big food companies, will know that the products that they make, people have enormous emotional connection to, an enormous emotional resonance, especially for branded products, but for others as well. And you know, they can be the things that bring people together. So you know, I always want to get people back to that, stop them feeling guilty about food, and get them back to that sort of joy and pleasure and togetherness. And I think if I did a little bit of that, and I got people feeling a bit less guilty, and you know, had a bit less of a troubled relationship with what they eat, and a bit more about enjoyment and pleasure, then that would make me happy.
Fantastic. Well, that concludes this episode of The Food People in Conversation with Anthony. On behalf of us all at The Food People and the In Conversation with audience, thank you so much for joining me today. You've given us a fascinating and I think truly thought-provoking perspective on our global food systems and the changes that need to happen to shift the future of food and drink to a sustainable future that feeds everyone. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So do join the TFP community for the details of all of the latest In Conversation with episodes, as well as the latest free to access food and drink trends foresight. Visit thefoodpeople.co.uk and complete your details at the footer of the page. On behalf of Anthony and myself, thank you so much for listening to The Food People in Conversation with. And I just leave you with one question. How are you shifting the future of food and drink? Thanks for listening.